Also, on that note, did you read Boots Riley sent out a tweet the other day talking about Black Klansman?
I did not, but I know that he's quite an erudite guy. Like he thinks about things very deeply, and he has kind of his finger on the pulse of what's going on and how to say it, I think.
Let me send you this link. So basically, Boots Riley's talking about Black Klansman, the Spike Lee movie. He kind of wrote like a mini essay about how the fight against racism is depicted in Black Klansman and how he disagrees with it. And so the main gist of the story is that Ron Washington, the main character in Black Klansman, a lot of the claims in his autobiography about how he fought against the KKK may not be as honorable as they make it seem. A lot of times white officers infiltrate these white supremacist groups to fight against black civil unrest movements. So he talks about how the Selma parade had a white officer who shot a black woman, an organizer, just to incite more riots and stoke more conflict. And how when they infiltrate these white supremacist organizations, it may not always be to fight against racism or disrupt these organizations. Sometimes they can be very self-serving.
Yeah, and he's saying here that like he says with these fabricated story notes that Black Klansman hits upon, Ron Stallworth looks like a hero, and so does his partner and the police force. Without the made-up stuff and with what we know of the actual history of police infiltration into radical groups and how they infiltrated and directed white supremacist organizations to attack those groups, Ron Stallworth is the villain.
Yes. Yeah. So
that's an interesting viewpoint. I would not have known about that without. He's clearly done a lot of research here and he's really taking a different take on that movie.
This is also like a broader conversation about Hollywoodizing actual events.
Yes.
We have to always understand that these are films and not documentaries or actual pieces of vetted history. And I think that's one of the problems people had with Jojo Rabbit as well. I know people who watched the film and enjoyed it, but were uncomfortable or didn't know how to feel about how Nazis and World War II was portrayed. Some were irked by how untruthful it is. In my opinion, though, I think you should always take these as art forms, especially if you know where Spike Lee's coming from.
Yes.
He's always been this like really, I wouldn't say loudmouth, but a very outspoken critic of certain societal values. And let's not forget that even though he's done a lot of good, he's a brilliant filmmaker, that we don't necessarily have to agree with all of politics or disagree with all of his politics.
Of course, yeah.
And I think that's one of the bigger conversations now is that you have this movement, Black Lives Matter, and then people interpret these things differently. And now you have like a bigger conversation that I think sprawls in all sorts of directions, and there's no real right answer. And I think that's part of what's putting more fuel on the fire, I guess.
So yeah, clearly there's just a gigantic amount of things to talk about on this topic. So let us do the intro real quick, and we'll come right back after that. Welcome to episode 76 of the Extra Buttery Podcast, a free-flowing conversation between two guys who love film and TV. My name is Robert Snow, and I'll be your host today along with my good friend Jason Chen. In this episode, we talk about The VAST of Night, a sci-fi mystery thriller about two kids who discover a mysterious radio signal. The movie is notable for its lengthy development and its tiny budget, but it just hit Amazon Prime very recently. And we'll be talking about Space Force, the new Netflix show lampooning America's newest military branch while flexing Steve Carell in the lead role. But circling back, let's close out our little chat about Black Lives Matter really quick, because it's obviously like it is the real discussion of the moment, and it would be we should use our platform, even if it's a tiny little one here on the podcast, to talk a little bit more about it.
You must have had some conversations with friends about this whole thing, right?
Yeah, well, I was on a video call last night actually with a couple of friends who we've actually had on the show, Kate Wilkinson and Pete Henderson, and we were actually watching, of all things, Hot Fuzz, which is it's a movie about the police, and it paints the police, like at least the main character, Nicholas Angel, who's played by Simon Pegg, in a very positive light. He's the hero of the movie, and he, in a weird way, it's an interesting time to be watching that movie because he is a kind of an idealistic cop who is very good at his job, but he's not able to switch off his cop brain and be a human being. But he's the kind of cop who, like, honestly, we probably need more of right now, because he doesn't like to fire his weapons. He is very intent on doing paperwork. He wants to make sure that the letter of the law is fulfilled to its fullest extent. And it's, going into it, I was like, is this really the right movie to be watching at this point in time? But it turned out to be like, the whole thrust of the movie, in spite of being like a parody of action movies, it's kind of advocating for the right kind of policing, where you kind of get rid of corruption, you get rid of the bad actors on police forces and the structures that support them, and you push for reform of some kind. I mean, obviously Edgar Wright, when he was making that movie, he had no idea that any of this was going to be coming down the line 10 or 15 years later, but here we are.
Yeah, I think there's always those shows on TV like Cops or
Live PD is another one, I think.
Yeah, NCIS, CSI, all those kind of things. I think if you watch them now, I think you can go back and sort of start criticizing the way that police and the justice system is portrayed, and how deeply inaccurate it can be. I mean, we just talked about how like these things are all fictional, but in some ways it really informs our day-to-day life. And I think when that Amy Cooper video surfaced, I think that was like the first real hard evidence of the mindset that they have in America about how just being close to proximity, people can feel threatened by someone, and believing that just accusing someone of, approaching them or acting threateningly is enough to get the police involved. And to do this also showcases that they do believe that this is a course of action that has a sort of verifiable outcome of some kind.
Right.
I think that was like the most jarring thing to me throughout all this. I think police brutality and inequality against Black people has been around for ages. Like, this is not a new thing, but that Amy Cooper video, I think, really hit home for a lot of people, especially me, actually.
For sure. And then once the Amy Cooper video had blown up, and once the protests surrounding the death of George Floyd had really taken hold, and they were happening like regularly day after day. And then we saw the response to the protests, and how, regardless of color, the protesters were being battered, and the police weren't just like standing off to the side and letting the protest happen. They were actively trying to shut it down, and they were beating people, and they were attacking journalists, and there was this clubbishness, this kind of boys club attitude where where it was like and that's not even entirely accurate, because obviously there's more and more women on the police forces, and they're, clearly some of them are also helping enforce these tactics. But their approach is like, it's us versus them. They don't see the protesters as expressing a valid point of view. They're there to control these people and stop them from protesting and discourage them from exercising their rights. And
just even the solidarity and the force of the police unions. Like, there was that clip of an old man in Buffalo, I think it was Buffalo, who got pushed down. Yeah. And two cops that pushed the old guy were arrested or charged with something. And then when they were released, like it seems like the entire police force showed up and applauded them as in some sort of support. And I do kind of get it, but I also don't understand why they feel the need to push someone like that, or to, have you seen clips where there's like water bottles for protesters and other people, and the police would come in and just start breaking them and slashing them?
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't understand how that is basically a way to deter even looters. Like, the looters aren't drinking that water on, laid out for them for protesters.
No.
I really don't get it. I think there's also another clip of, I think it was a guy in LA who's kneeling and who's just shouting at the police. He was just like an emotional outburst. It wasn't anything aggressive or offensive, and he'd end up getting arrested. And it is so surreal, actually.
It's the kind of stuff that you expect to see in a dystopian movie or TV show in an actual police state that's run by like a cartoonish bad guy, but it's happening in like clips that are being tweeted out live every minute of every day, and you can't understand how it all fell apart,
And well, you start questioning everything too, right? Because you're like, okay, this is a 20-second clip of something gruesome, but where's the rest of it? Where's the context? I don't understand a lot of the clips that I'm seeing. Like, some of it's good and I get it right away, but the plastic water thing, someone has to explain that to me, because I don't understand how that's, regular policing activity. It's just bottles of water for protesters. Why do you need to, smash them and break them? Not only is it terrible for the environment, it's also a waste of water. And you like concentrate on the looters all you want, but the looters aren't the ones drinking that water.
It's gotten out of hand in so many places. It's all at once. And
I think it's safe to say that we are all better off after all this, in that we're more educated and hopefully we listen. Anti-racism should just always be a thing. Like, me being a visible minority and an immigrant, I wouldn't say I've ever experienced overt racism, but there's always like certain slights here and there, especially if you grew up in a certain environment and then you're transported to another environment where it's completely different. But I've always felt that the best way to do this is to actually get to know people, just to educate yourselves on history. I kind of did that as well. I actually just discovered that there was like a Black community called Hogan's Alley in Vancouver. And it was this community that had jazz bars and a lot of immigrants and a lot of ethnicities. I think you would like this too. I'll send you the clip later. But this whole community was shuttered when urban development came along and they built this like huge viaduct and displaced everyone. And there's a little society called the Hogan's Alley Society that, is trying to, I guess, keep its memory. And there's some interesting stories about Jimi Hendrix's mom being there, Sammy Davis playing jazz there. And by all accounts, it was like this really vibrant community with a lot of jazz music. And unfortunately, it's gone. And I think we owe it to ourselves to actually read up on this stuff, especially locally. Like, even though Canada doesn't have a big Black population, there are always certain things that locally that are tied to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. To change gears in probably the most awkward way possible.
This is a movie podcast. We just got sidetracked, but
yeah,
we thought it was important to talk about it. But
we'll lead things off with the VAST of Night, which is something that I found out about via Twitter, actually. Film Twitter kind of coalesced around this movie because it had recently been posted to Prime Video. Amazon acquired it out of a film festival that I think it was the Slam Dance Film Festival in January 2019. So it's actually like Amazon's been sitting on it for over a year now. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't recognize any of the actors involved, but the fact that it was like it's this 90-minute long, very tight little story set in the 1950s in, is it New Mexico?
Yes.
It's just about a local radio DJ, a guy in his early 20s, who's friends with a local 16-year-old who works as a telephone exchange switch operator. They, one night when most of the town is kind of congregated in a local school gym for a basketball match, they start hearing these strange sounds coming in over the phone lines. And the two of them kind of band together and they decide to try to figure out what's going on.
718 here at WOTW. We got a sound we'd like to play that seems to be bouncing around the valley tonight.
Yes, I have a story that might be helpful. I can tell you what's going on.
The sound we heard out in the desert, it was coming from thousands of feet higher than anything could fly.
I mean, talk about it very much feels like an old school TV serial.
It actually like forces you to feel that way, because it starts off as like this television set that's black and white.
Yeah.
And the camera slowly zooms towards this TV set to basically tell you you are in an episode of like the Twilight Zone or something like
exactly. They call it, in the world of the movie, they called it like paradox theater. And
yes.
But it's got the same kind of like Rod Serling style voiceover kind of leading you into the events. And I mean, it's the kind of story that I could easily see. Like, I know Jordan Peele recently rebooted the Twilight Zone, and I haven't seen any of those new episodes. But it feels like it could have been just an episode of that new show, because it's clearly they were using like newer digital cameras to capture the actual cinematography. And when we I'm not to spoil anything, but when there's a reveal at the very end of the movie, you can tell that some more modern prop making and VFX stuff went into that. But it's still a very closely you don't see a whole lot. It's all allowed to play out in your imagination, like a very Hitchcockian kind of like, it's what you can't see that gives you the best thrills kind of way of doing things.
So it's like, it's one of those sci-fi movies where the less you see, the more suspenseful it is. So kind of like Cloverfield, where you don't see the alien, and then there's always like this presence outside that you're unaware of, or like Jaws, the horror is unseen.
Yeah.
I just want to side note that all of these sci-fi like mystery thrillers always takes place in some random small town in America, eh?
Yeah.
Like there's something about like the dichotomy between like a big alien presence versus, a town of 200 people who experience this one thing that no one else in the universe is experiencing.
And they very like whoever, I'm not familiar with any of the people behind the camera on this. And it sounded like you done a bit more research into this, which we can talk about, like the production behind this, which we can talk about in a sec. But what struck me was how in the script, they insert a little tiny bit of dialogue to say, well, these aliens have been they've been visiting this town. They seem to really like this place, and they don't like big cities because I guess there's, they know that if they fly over a big city, too many people will see them, and their element of surprise will be gone. Whatever they're doing, we never find out what the alien's actual goal is. But they also one of the characters talks about how she suspects that not only do they like small towns because of the fewer witnesses kind of thing, but they actually prefer to come in on nights when there's some sort of big community event like the basketball game going on, where the majority of even the small town aren't there, and it's just like a handful of people who might happen across the ship floating in the air.
So you were talking about that final sort of scene that's kind of shocking, and I was kind of shocked by it too, because I knew this was a low budget movie going in. And it felt like the budget was a lot higher than it actually is, which is $700,000.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So think about like how much movies cost, especially ones set in space or have things to do with aliens. And then you think about that final scene, you think, wow, they did all this for $700,000.
Right.
And not even just the final sort of scene, but like the amount of effort that took into organizing some of the scenes, because there's certain scenes that are uncut, like unedited, edited cleverly to show that it's not edited. A tracking shots of like 9 minutes, 10 minutes. There's one scene where they start at the school and then they do like a single tracking shot to the radio station.
Yeah.
And it actually passes through the entire town, and you see like the playground, the forest, the grass, the trees, everything. I don't know if you know this, but this was actually filmed in September 2016.
Oh, wow. Okay. No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it's directed by Andrew Patterson, and this is his first sort of feature film. And for the longest time, it kept getting rejected from film festival after film festival until it caught a little bit of good fortune in 2019 at TIFF, actually, where it was the People's Choice runner-up for Midnight Madness.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then afterwards, it won the Best First Screenplay Independent Spirit Awards, and then Netflix picked it up.
Or Amazon Prime picked it up.
Yeah, Amazon Prime picked it up. So Andrew Patterson had directed this. Took him reportedly a whole year to edit. Couldn't find any takers. And then all of a sudden, it just hits it big. And I think one of the reasons for it not getting a lot of attention is that if you look on Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 91% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but a 60% rating on audience score.
Oh, yeah.
So this film does feel a little niche because it feels like an episode of like the X-Files or some sort of like niche sci-fi alien show, but it's very well done. And I just don't think, because the plot is a bit paper thin and a lot of it's dialogue, and it's really hard to follow actually the first few moments because all you see is two people walking around the gym and having all sorts of random conversations. It's hard to figure out who's who.
Yeah, the dialogue is very dense, and you have to listen very closely to figure out like how much of what they're talking about is important to the plot and how much is just like setting the scene of this small town.
It's a bit Aaron Sorkin-esque.
Yeah.
In that there's a lot of people walking and talking at the same time. And you have to really parse through a lot of things. It's a short movie though, I think around 90 minutes.
Yeah.
But it accomplishes quite a bit. And it's one of those movies where, because of its budget, you won't get a lot of sets. It's a lot of people reacting to things in a single setting. So, for example, Faye, who is the switchboard operator, has this 9-10 minute scene where she's having 3 or 4 different conversations with 3 or 4 different people on the phone, and she's plugging things in and out. And it reminds me of Phone Booth. With Colin Farrell, where he spends the entire movie in a phone booth just talking to people,
right?
Or like Tom Hardy in Locke, where he spends the entire movie in a car, and it actually takes a lot of like good dialogue, good acting to really make it work. And I think the Vast of Night does a really good job of doing this.
Yeah, it almost has a bit of a stage play kind of feel in those long takes where,
yes,
they would have had to hire actors. Again, like I don't think I've seen anything with this cast before. They would have had to hire actors who had who had a lot of theatrical training or who were comfortable sitting there and delivering these big chunks of text and remembering all the cues and everything.
There's a lot of monologuing.
Yeah, without relying on like the cut of the camera to allow you to move on to the next chunk. That's from that perspective, like you could see this being like either originating as a stage play or even being adapted after the fact into a stage play and it working just as well. It's not going to break any crazy new ground.
No.
It's telling a story that probably was already been told countless times on shows from the period that it's set in, like from the 1950s. But I don't know, the execution is just it's one of those things where the execution just raises it above the basics and makes it that whole greater than the sum of its parts kind of thing. And I'm really glad that it kind of it finally broke through, even if it took them 4 years to do it.
The one thing that I kind of didn't enjoy as much was the cinematography. There's something with the color grading where it makes it difficult to see because this whole movie takes place in a single night. And it's very, very dark.
It almost happens like in real time, actually. Like it's...
Yeah, it does. And so the main character is Everett. Everett Sloan, who, by the way, shares the same name as Orson Welles' Mercury Theater.
Oh.
The host of Mercury Theater. But anyway, so he's kind of like this brown hair, kind of skinny kid with horn ring glasses. And there's another character, a bit older one, who drives a car, who's also kind of tall and lanky with brown hair with horn rim glasses. And it was a little difficult to tell who was who at certain points. And I just thought if it was, lit a little differently, I think it would have been more interesting visually. There's a lot of drab colors in this. There's a lot of browns, a lot of darks, a lot of blacks in there.
Yeah.
So that was the only sort of like problem I had, especially if you're watching this movie in daytime. It's really hard to see sometimes what's going on.
Yeah, if your screen is washed out. Well, I think part of that is like because the way the dialogue is written and the way the action plays out, it's actually nothing like a TV serial in a weird way, because if you were writing a TV serial about like a small town where an alien descends and everyone's kind of freaking out, there would be more plot, and there would be like it would be told in a very consumable way, I think. A lot more of an entry level kind of way. But this, like we were saying, it involves you like listening very closely to very densely packed conversational dialogue. And there's these long tracking shots, these oneers, and then the lighting that you were talking about, it almost makes me feel as like, we start outside the TV, but then we go into the episode, and they go for this very naturalistic lighting that is very dark because there's just not a lot of street lights around. There's the sources of illumination are few, like you have like car headlights, you have the occasional person has a flashlight on them or a lighter for a cigarette. And it is very, very dark. And they seem to be doing that deliberately, I think.
Fair enough. That's a fair point. It also like moves in and out of the TV screen at least twice.
Yeah.
So like it constantly reminds you that you're watching sort of an episode of a TV show.
And I'm like, it almost made me think, I was like, wouldn't it be like this is probably like a very unlikely thing, but wouldn't it be cool if like the extra attention from the Amazon pickup could lead to them making more of these? I don't know if there's anybody involved with the original production who would even consider doing that, but it would be very cool if like, and if it became like an anthology thing where it wasn't necessarily these same characters or anything like that, but it was another story set in the 1950s in a different town with like a different plot.
I was going to say it could make a very good TV series. There's a lot of attention to detail from like the costumes, the cars, even the gymnasium where there's a basketball game being played seems very historically accurate.
Yeah.
So props to that. It just, I think where it loses its audience is its plot and how dense it is and how inaccessible it is because of the lighting is just not very well lit. And like you said, it's on Amazon Prime and no one's ever heard of this movie. So
yeah, it's one of those things that's only going to really spread by word of mouth, I think.
Yeah, and as I think the audience score is low for those reasons. It's a bit of a niche film. It's kind of like how people just, not everyone's a fan of the X-Files. I think you can appreciate it for what it is, but not everyone really, really likes it and thinks it's, a cultural touchstone, I guess. I'll tell you what's not a cultural touchstone, though.
What's that?
Space Force.
No, oh boy.
Yeah, so I started the series thinking it'd be really funny. First episode, I was like, all right, fine. It's a pilot. Not the best, but I'm going to stick through it. And then by about like episode 4, I'm starting to question why I'm spending time on this. And then by about episode 6 or 7, I'm just like, wow, this is a really waste of time. But at that point, I'm also of the mind that I should just finish the series anyway. So I finished it, and I don't blame you if you don't.
The president is creating a new branch
In the United States military.
Space Force, which Mark will run.
I don't. It has always been my dream to start something from the ground up. But space is hard.
May I suggest that become the new Space Force motto?
Yeah, because this, like Netflix made they got some decent press when they announced that this thing was in development, because it was not long after the real life Space Force was announced by Mr. Trump. And, people were obviously, lampooning it just in news headlines and in conversation and stuff, because it just sounded so ridiculous. And then Netflix is like, well, hey, why don't we get the guys from The Office together to do a office comedy about what it's like to be in Space Force. Mm-hmm. And from that very basic sketch, they decided to spin out, and obviously they're adding, taking artistic liberty quite a bit with this, and they're projecting a lot of stuff that isn't really happening with the real life Space Force for comedic effect. But despite all of that, they've clearly tried to do a lot of world building and construct this whole scenario. It just does not work. The performances feel stilted. The very funny people who have been cast in it are not as funny as we're used to them being.
I think a lot of that has to do with the script. I think this whole thing feels rushed.
Yes.
So when Donald Trump announces Space Force, everyone started laughing. And some bigwig at Netflix probably thought, oh, you know what? Mr. Trump just hand delivered us a great premise for a new show.
Right.
How would a show about the most potentially money-wasting branch of the military be? Like, how funny would it be as a show? And how much money would be wasted? Because, you know, these things practically write themselves. Now, the problem with Space Force is that it seems like real life is funnier than the show.
Well, you know what it reminds me of is the Patton Oswalt had a new Netflix stand-up special come out recently, a couple of weeks ago, called I Love Everything. And deep into the special, like around the 45-minute mark or something, he brings up the topic of how people think that stand-up comedians are having the time of their lives right now with Trump being president, and that
it's difficult.
Yeah, and the assumption is that, you know, there's so much to make fun of, and comedians are probably have more work than they've had in years. But what Oswalt points out in his special is that you like what you were just saying. The administration is so ridiculous and dangerous, but so ridiculous that nothing you could write could adequately live up to what's really happening. And he compares the actual real life administration to an 18-wheeler loaded with monkeys high on PCP that crashes into a freight train loaded with feces.
It's true. You can't make this stuff up that's happening, like, in real world.
So it's like, and then he's like, oh, well, you know, a comedian could come up and start telling jokes about that, but the average person on the side of the street be like, no, man, I want to watch the actual 18-wheeler loaded with PCP-addicted monkeys. Like, come on.
Yeah.
So yeah, everything in Space Force feels very like, it just feels like low-hanging fruit. Like the jokes were just handed to them. I
mean, also the jokes don't really land, a lot of them. So this was ordered in January 2019. A year and a half later, this is like a full-blown show on Netflix with like a big cast. But you also wonder, like, did it really serve itself trying to be ready so soon after it was originally ordered? Like, it seems like there was not a lot of thought put into it in terms of the overarching sort of story and theme, because there's 10 episodes, half an hour each. It's not a lot of screen time, but from episode 1 to 10, they go from the formation of the Space Force to landing on the moon to having a conflict on the moon, when I feel like all these things could be teased out. And even within episodes, there's so many scenes that don't connect with each other. There's so many characters that are just shoved in that serve no real purpose. And I wonder if it would really help if they just take their time. The silver lining is that one of the co-creators of the show, Greg Daniels, who was producer on The Office, he's never really made a show that's been good in its first season. So when the American Office first debuted, it actually wasn't like a huge hit until season 2. So I guess that's the silver lining.
Right.
But I don't know if you feel the same way as I do, but Lisa Kudrow's character, useless. Yuri, useless. The dim-witted Southern guy who can't pronounce words right, you know, not needed. There's that episode where he goes to visit Lisa Kudrow, his wife, Steve Carell, and they spend basically an entire episode discussing their conjugal visit and their relationship.
Right.
And has nothing to do with Space Force.
Yeah.
And so there's all these like little things, little scenes that are supposed to be funny, and you're supposed to put them all together into this great big show, but it never comes together.
Yeah. And well, like Carell, like we should talk about him real quick. You know, he's playing this, admittedly, like the backstory for him makes him seem like a fairly competent guy. He was a 3-star general before the events of the show start, and he had flown combat missions in every type of fighter jet, and he'd been he had crashed during a mission in Serbia and been like hunted through the woods by like terrorists and stuff. So like he's not like a doofus the way Michael Scott is, you know, Carell's most famous role. But the show kind of wants him to be super competent at being a military guy, but also incompetent at running the Space Force. And it can't.
I definitely think he's a doofus.
It can't really have it both ways. It's
well, it's supposed to be funny because he's this really accomplished guy, but he's also a bit of a doofus lacking self-awareness, seeing as he's like really oddball, stupid ideas.
Right.
But at the same time, it also feels like this is realistic. that we have people in the military who fail upwards.
Right.
And so it's not funny anymore. It's almost like reality. And even though it's supposed to be a satire, even though it's supposed to be lampooning the Space Force, it almost takes itself a little too seriously.
Yeah, because they all, like, people on the Space Force really believe in the mission, and they want to do good, and they want to please the president. They want to, like, the science team wants to actually advance the cause of human spaceflight.
Yeah. There are certain episodes, certain lines where they question why the Space Force even exists, but they never really go far into examining that. I think one of my favorite scenes is like when the chiefs of the military branches come together in their war room, and then they start making fun of each other and having this contest about saying which branch of the military is the strongest or the most wealthy. And those are some of my favorite scenes, but it's never extended beyond that room.
You know, they set up this rivalry between Steve Carell's character and the head of the Air Force, another general who, what's the name of that actor? Tom something.
It's Noah Emmerich.
Oh, Noah Emmerich, right. And of
he
course,
plays a really good asshole though.
Yeah, like Noah Emmerich has got a long career playing authority figures and guys who have sticks up their asses and stuff. So that was that was good casting. You know, there's lots of great casting, but
it's the talent's wasted.
The scripts just aren't there. Like I'm reminded of Mark Kermode's rubric for comedies, where he tries to count how many like gut busting laughs he has over the course of a movie. And
there's 0 in this one.
Yeah. I mean, I can count one from episode 2 that I actually remember. And that's the sequence where they send the monkey, where the monkey has already been sent up into space, and they're trying to get the monkey to repair a broken satellite. And they're trying to communicate with the monkey through sign language and entice it to do it, to, like, you know, and it's admittedly like it's an incredibly hard job. Like, how do you get a monkey to pick up a power tool and float out into space and take a satellite or take a solar panel and like get it to weld onto this thing, right? Like, it's a hard job even for a human, and they're trying to communicate it with it non-verbally. And the whole time the monkey is just like signing things like hungry for banana and horny and stuff. And the absurdity of that actually got to me, and I was legitimately laughing, but I think it was the only time in the first 6 episodes that I was like laughing for real. And that should be an indication of just how weak this whole thing is.
Yeah, even in its most absurd moments, it's not that absurd, you know? Like, there's a scene where John Malkovich, who plays the chief scientist, and Steve Carell are arguing about like exoskeleton bodysuits on space. And the punchline is that, you know, the people who are supposed to be in these suits hear about how their lives don't matter, and they're just going to go with the cheapest suit available. Even that sounds not like a joke, but more like a real life actual conversation.
Yeah.
And so it stops being funny. There are times where Steve Carell still channels a bit of Michael Scott. And I think it's because if you think about the movies and the other show, the morning show that he's doing with Apple, none of them have become big hits. So I think he's kind of defaulted back to what made him popular in the first place. And so you get this character who obviously has a heart of gold, but he's not very bright. So he has to rely on other characters to carry the show for him. And other than John Malkovich, I don't know if anyone else can do it. Partially because even some of the guest stars only show up here and there to drop a punchline. So for example, Fred Willard, rest in peace. He was actually one of the few bright spots on the show, but his jokes are basically boiled down to he's going to call Steve Carell and have his sort of like old people moments with dementia.
Yeah.
And there's like a fart joke thrown in there. And I really don't know what the focus is. There's another scene where there's a congressional hearing and they're lampooning Nancy Pelosi and AOC, and Ben Schwartz's character, the social media director, is a direct play on Anthony Scaramucci.
Yeah.
So there are certain, you know, smart moments, but I feel like they just never had enough time to write good jokes. It feels too rushed. It feels like they were too concerned with taking advantage of the moment and then just running away with it and not actually thinking about how this might turn out. And in truth, the real Space Force probably has more comedic moments coming up.
Well, and you think too about like what they had to put into this. Like, this is not, compared to The Office, this is a very big budget show. Like, you know, they have this gigantic campus that they've had to shoot in. It looks like a university somewhere in Colorado that they're using.
But the scenes in space are so fake. I wonder if that's on purpose. People, like, reviewers have praised like the special effects, but to me, it's like, dude, it just seems like they're hopping and then someone turned the speed down, and that's what it's like to be on the moon. There's no sense of gravity in it.
Right.
There's all sorts of weird things going on with the special effects.
I almost think that, like, you know, if they had not tried to make it look as expensive as it is, regardless of like the actual visual effects, if they had kept it to like just this one office block or something, they wouldn't have had all these opportunities for distraction with like rockets going off and things like that. And they could have been a little bit more limited to making the scripts as funny as they could possibly be.
And, you know, for something that lampoons Trump's, you know, pet project, for lack of a better word, Trump is never mentioned. Like, the president is never really mentioned in the show.
No, they make all these winking references to, like, you know, tweeting and
other politicians too, but they never go straight for the jugular.
I don't know. It just... It doesn't connect. It's a real shame because...
What a shame, though, because you had such a good premise to begin with.
Yeah. And now, has Netflix announced whether they're going to do a season 2 of this? Like, are they pushing forward with it, even though the critical response is kind of lukewarm?
Initially, I think there was word that they had already approved a second season, but I haven't seen anything since. And like I said, it has a potential to be even better in season 2, but it seems like they covered all the plot points they want. They formed the team. They designed a rocket, they put people in space, they put people on the moon, and there's a conflict on the moon. And I feel like each of those could be in different seasons. It seems like they just wanted to go over everything really quick and then figure out the rest later. Steve Carell, I don't think he's ever going to shed that Michael Scott sort of stereotype or sort of label.
I mean, he's making a strong effort of it in like dramatic movies, you know, like Foxcatcher and Big Short and stuff like that.
And Beautiful Boy, yeah, but they're not big hits, and he's not really the big star in those movies. If you think about the movies and the TV shows he's sort of hit big with, he's always playing this dim-witted sort of everyday guy.
Well, it's hard to escape the pull of a big show like that too. Like, you think about how The Office is such a valuable property, even in reruns, where streaming services are paying gigantic sums of money to get the exclusive rights to stream The Office. And you talk to people like out in everyday life, and they will talk about how to this day they will put on a rerun of The Office just as something to have on in the background while they cook. Or
yeah, I do that.
You know, and that's, you know, that speaks to the quality of the show, but it also says that, like, you know, anyone who's involved with that production, how do they make that break from that, and how do they take roles and make choices for their careers that helps people see them in a different light? I guess maybe John Krasinski has probably been the most successful because he just went a hard break. Like, he didn't even do drama. He did like hardcore action, like the absolute opposite of what his character was on the show.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to unsee Jim, though, when you watch Jack Ryan or any of his other stuff, really. Especially for me anyway. There are certain times in Jack Ryan where I look at him and I still feel like he has those Jim Halpert mannerisms.
Right.
and Michael Scott has the same, I did the same thing. General Mark Naird, who Steve Carell plays, he still has this, like, whenever he gets upset, he clenches his jaw and then his sad puppy eyes comes out and he sort of like frowns and he hunches over a little bit. Yeah. And they have very similar mannerisms. So it's really hard to separate the characters. And again, the supporting cast doesn't really, not that they're not talented, it's just it's written poorly. Like, I couldn't give two shits about his wife, his daughter's love interest, the supposed Russian spy, his potential new private contractor girlfriend. It doesn't really fit. And John Malkovich, I feel like he's been playing the same character for the past 10 years now. Like this really eccentric, foul-mouthed, smart-aleck. And he has some good lines, but even then, some of the jokes don't land. So I'd be surprised if this gets ordered to season 2, just because how poor it is. And I don't think it's because the expectations were sky high. I just think objectively, this is not a funny show.
Well, it will be something to watch because this is a completely different genre, but it reminds me of like how Bright came out on Netflix, and it quickly became like the most watched thing on the platform, and Netflix quickly approved a sequel to it. But I've heard nothing about Bright since then, and maybe that's because Max Landis, who wrote the original Bright, maybe they couldn't get a script out of him because he's toxic.
Yeah, he's in trouble now. Yeah,
terrible guy from everything I've heard. But maybe it's because Netflix actually listened to the critics, which would be surprising. I mean, maybe they said, hey, this might have had a lot of people watching it, but maybe they were able to figure out how much of that was hate watching, and they second guessed their early approval.
I think Netflix's bread and butter now is those short documentaries. I think that's what they're going to find
right.
the most success with. Actually, the one final thing I want to say about Space Force is, if you think about Parks and Rec, if you think about The Office, if you think about Friends, if you think about all these really funny workplace sitcoms and shows, the one thing they all kind of have in common is a really familiar theme song or opening credit scene.
Right.
And I don't know why exactly, but Netflix original series, very few of them have a theme song or jingle.
Yeah. And
I wonder if that hurts them in making Space Force memorable, because I think you could have a really funny song about Space Force and make it into a parody. I don't know, get The Lonely Island to come up with something.
Right, yeah.
And so every Netflix show starts off with a black title screen which just says Netflix original series in all sorts of different fonts. And I guess you could save money and get right to the show and get right to the point, but I kind of do enjoy the jingle of The Office when it comes on, and it's very instantly memorable and puts me in a good mood, and it kind of just it's like an appetizer. It kind of sets the tone, kind of sets the table for the rest of what's to come.
You think about some of this shit, the really, really good stuff on Netflix that has certainly stuck with me in the past little while, are the rare ones that do have good opening titles. So I think about like Mindhunter. Mm-hmm. Its opening titles are admittedly gory and they can be a little bit hard to look at, but the combination of the visuals and the music and everything, the sound design, that's a really good opening title. Another one that comes to mind is actually the opening for Patriot Act with Hassan Minhaj. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've watched any of that talk show, but it's not really a talk show. It's more like a political comedy in the style of John Oliver, but he's got this kind of patriotic trumpeting kind of backed track of him kind of looking out over this protest, and it's a fully like very nicely animated opening title sequence, and it's not very long. It's only like 15 seconds long or something, but it helps set the tone for what you're about to watch. And I think like if they could do something like that for Space Force, it might have actually like set the tone and just get people in the right mood to watch it and kind of engage with the characters.
Because it's really bland otherwise. There's no music in the show. There's a bit of stilted dialogue, and that's it. That's basically it. The occasional pop tune here and there, but that gets old pretty quick. But
yeah, it's too bad. Well, I think that about does it for this episode. So thank you for tuning in. You can head over to kinetoscope.ca, where Jason's been writing up some reviews of the show that we were talking about just now, but also one of the new additions to HBO Max, Love Life with Anna Kendrick. So you can check that out, as well as Snowpiercer on Netflix, the adaptation of the Bong Joon-ho film. And hit us up on social media. On Twitter, you can find us at KinetoscopeCA, and write us an email and just get in touch. You can use our new podcast themed Gmail account, extrabutterypod@gmail.com. So get in touch with us on that.
Hopefully when we talk next time, we'll have more good shows that we can recommend. 2 thumbs up for Vast of Night.
Yes.
And 2 thumbs down for Space Force.
Yes.
So we're at 50-50. So next time we'll shoot for 100% or something closer to that.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for listening. My name is Jason Chen, coming from Vancouver.
And my name is Robert Snow, coming to you from Toronto. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.